First Sergeant Camp here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and today in the workshop we are tackling a popular viewer-requested build, how to make a collapsible Civil War camp cot. For a complete cut list and detailed layout and instructions, be sure to pick up A.J. Hamler's Civil War Woodworking Volume 2. These blueprints and designs are unique to his research, and I want to honor his work, so I'm going to leave out some of the key layout information and some of the key dimensions. For complete instructions on how to, be sure to pick up his book, and then you can follow along with the video. Like I said, this cot collapses, so the head and footboards remove from the bed rails, and you can tie everything up in the bed rails with the pins that are held together by a rope. It's pretty lightweight, and it's pretty comfortable too. I mean, it's no modern memory foam mattress or inflatable air mattress, as some people like to use, but it does get you off the cold, damp ground. For this build, there are quite a few things for you to think about before you get building. First things are you're going to need to consider your height and weight. So you may need to modify the length. I think Hamler said he's 6 feet, so if you're taller than that, you may need to make bigger, longer bed rails. If you're, say, a heavier person, you may need to consider whether or not you need to add center legs to your bed rails for additional support for sleeping. Also, if you're lightweight, you might be able to save quite a bit of money by substituting softwood, such as 2x material from the box store, as opposed to using hardwoods. Now, when given an opportunity, I prefer to use hardwoods. They are more expensive, but they are harder wearing and more rigid. So if you are a heavier person, well, even if you're a lightweight person, whenever you get into, say, these pine bed rails, the pine is going to flex considerably more than a hardwood. So the heavier you are, the more the bed rail's going to flex. It may not affect your night's rest, but it may be something that you seriously want to consider when you're choosing your materials. But to give you an example of sort of the price difference also, for the person I'm building this for, we went with pine to save some money. And so for these two bed rails and pines, probably $6 to $10. If I built it out of 8-quarter oak, you'd be looking at $75 to $100 just in the bed rails. The bed rails in oak would of course be more rigid and flex less, but this should be an adequate accommodation for this person who's going to be sleeping in it. But the rest of the build is entirely out of oak. Oak head footboards, oak legs, and oak pins that hold everything together. So do a little bit of calculating, figure out how or if you need to modify Hamler's design to fit your own unique needs. And with that, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll show you how I make these headboards. Now this one is complete. So I have all the mortises chopped, and I have all the final shapes cut in. The only thing left to do on this one is maybe chamfer all the edges to add a little bit of durability to the finished result. So now we have one more end to cut, and you can see, since I'm not done chopping all my mortises, nothing has been cut out. This is all nice and square, and I encourage you to avoid the temptation at all costs to cut the curves out before you're done with your joinery, because having square reference surfaces is going to make layout so much simpler if you ever have to double check something. And so the other thing to keep in mind is your last mortise is kind of your most important, because if you mess up and you make it too big, then you have to fix 7 more mortises to match. You probably don't, but I like everything to be the same size on my work. So Hamler shows you where to drill the holes in the legs and in the headboards, so you have nice reference places to start from. And so since I have this one ready to go, I'm going to flip it over. Now Hamler, he starts with the legs. He cuts all the mortises in the legs first. I, however, prefer to do the headboard first. So now I got my pin in. I'm just going to take my square and put the leg square against the headboard and my square, and we are good. Now, to make sure it's perfectly accurate, I'm going to take my marking knife now, and starting lightly and keeping pressure on my piece, I'm just going to go around and score all my edges. And then we'll get to chopping. Now that we have our mortise carefully transcribed onto our leg, I need to transfer this layout to the reverse side of the board, so that way I can chop the mortise in from both sides and give a nice entry and exit to the mortise. Now, Hamler, all he does is use a jigsaw, which for, I think, most people would work fine. I don't want to have to worry about blowout and tear out. And the other thing too with jigsaws that you have to take into account is deflection. So if you're new to it and you're working the jigsaw too hard, the blade, when it's cutting, will bend. So you can have a mortise that's wider on one side or shallower on one side, depending on how that jigsaw is working. I don't have to worry about that so much when I'm chopping these by hand traditionally. So for this, all that I do is I just transfer my lines around. And so I'll just stick my knife in my knife wall, put my square up to it, put a little mark in the wood up top, and then I follow that mark all the way around. And then when it comes to my depth, I just loosen up my square, stick my knife in the knife wall, and tighten it up. And that way I can have the same image on the front and the back. So I have my mark here. Now just hold my square tightly to my piece and transcribe that line. Now that I have the mortise transferred on both sides of the piece, all I do now is find a center line in the middle of the mortise, so that way I can remove the bulk of the waste with just a Forstner bit. And you know, what size you use is going to depend on how big your mortises are. So I just put it roughly in that center line and get my hole started. And then I want to take this over to the drill press and get it cleaned out. With the bulk of the waste removed, I'm just going to take my chisel now and clean up my knife wall to give me a nice little starting point for my chopping. So this follows all the same practices that we've done so far up to this point. Take your time. You don't want to over clean or get too wild with your hammer. Be watchful when you're going along the grain like this. And I'm going to go around and do that on this side and that side. Now with my knife walls nicely defined, I'm going to go in with this coping saw and clear out more material so I have less to chisel. And how much you take out is entirely up to you. And now that we have the bulk of the waste, it's really just all about chopping the mortise, just like we've done in our other videos. So just be somewhere comfortable so you can make sure that your chisel is perpendicular, and chop, and clean. And you just do that. And then when you get halfway or a little more than halfway on one side, flip it over and come in from the other side. Another easy tip to make sure that your mortises fit exactly to each other is to go ahead and insert your rivet in the leg and put it onto your head or footboard. And then square your leg up like you did the first time, like that. And then any variance you can clean up by using your headboard as a flat reference surface, and you can trim it. Now, one thing you can't really see in the shot is I do have a sacrificial board underneath the leg. So that way that'll support the wood fibers and help prevent tear out. But you know, it's always going to be a little hit and miss. So make sure you take it easy, you take small bites, and you check your work as you go to make sure that you're not creating a bunch of ugly tear out on the opposite side. But this is one way to help you keep things square and clean out your corners really well. Now that all of our mortises are cut, now we can take our first headboard that we did all of our layout on and transfer all the curves and layout lines for cutting onto our square piece. Then be sure when you cut it out, I'm going to use a bandsaw. You can also use a jigsaw or a coping or a turning saw. Make sure that you cut outside of the line, and then that way you can clean it up with a sander or a spoke shave or a sanding block. Before we get to final sanding on the head and footboard, I'm just going to take a few minutes and put a simple 1/8 inch round over around all the pieces to break the corners off and give it a smoother finish and more durable edge. Now that we have our head and footboard cut out and assembled, I went ahead and cut the bed rails to fit. I didn't show it because it's pretty simple. You just rip your bed rails to the proper dimensions until they fit easily into the mortises on the head and footboard. There is an important thing to note on fit as far as the bed rails going into the mortises. Normally when you cut joinery, you want a nice friction fit. But this is going to be an outdoor item. And if you make that exacting fit, as soon as this wood is exposed to dampness or humidity, this wood is going to swell no matter how well you try to protect your wood. And the last thing you want is your bed rails to swell and get stuck in your head and footboard, making it really difficult to disassemble when you're trying to leave your event. So there's a bit of a Goldilocks zone that you just kind of have to figure out on your own. You want your bed rails to fit in and out of the head and footboard
easily, and you want to have a little bit of slack, but you don't want it so loose that they're rattling around in there. It's going to take a little bit of trial and error. And what I highly recommend, and Hamler does too, is for your first couple of ends taking this cot out, take a custom-made sanding block that will fit in the dimensions of your mortises. So that way, if it does start to get a little bit snug, then you can fine-tune it in the field. So that way your cot is custom fitted to the environment in which it's going to spend most of its time. It might take an event or two, but it's definitely worth your time to do. Now, for the next part, we need to figure out how to make some braces to hold our footboard not only in place, but to also help us cinch up any slack that we deliberately have built into this design. Hamler has an entire page in his book on different alternatives as far as building this brace. And the brace provides a stop, so you know how far your head footboard will fit every time, and it provides additional stability. So what Hamler recommends is to cut some 4-inch blocks of wood, and they just need to be the exact width of the bed rail they're going on. And there's going to be one of these braces on every inside corner. The height, depending on your design and how you build your bed, the overall height needs to be on the inside of the head and footboard. You don't want your brace protruding and being visible. I have mine just sucked up just a little bit so you can't see this from the other side. So you'll go ahead and cut 4-inch blocks, 4-inch blocks, the exact width of your bed rails, and I'll show you how I lay these out. Now that we have our 4-inch blocks cut to the proper dimensions, we put a little taper on it for some style. Now on mine, the overall height is 1.25 inches, just like Hamler's book, and then the taper side is 3/4 inch. So I'll mark that. So I'll go from the corner to 3/4 inch, and I'll draw a straight line. I don't know if that'll show up. Yeah. So from the corner to 3/4 inch, and then to design my curves, I just dig through my spare washers and find a washer that gives me a radius that I find pleasing to the eye. And then I will just trace that corner onto my piece. And then once I have my shape determined, I'll just go and cut it out on the bandsaw. Now that we have our braces all cleaned up, we need to lay out some places for our screw holes. So what I do is I first try to find center. To do this, I'll usually just eyeball it, draw a line, flip it over, come in from the other side, and dead center is in between those two lines. So I was pretty close the first time. Okay, now that I have my center line, I'll come in here, and then I'll have my screw holes 3/4 inch from each end. And then I will take this over to the drill press and drill the holes for the size of screws I plan on using. Okay, I have the braces drilled and countersunk, and I already have this one set up on this end of the bed rail. For screws, I believe these are number 10 standard screws. I think there's a 2-inch one in the front and a 1.25-inch one in the rear of the brace. Now, remember, Hamler says to leave at least 2 inches protruding from the end of your footboard on your bed rails. And so I went ahead and did all my factoring, so I know exactly where my 2 inches is, plus my headboard, plus my leg. So this is exactly where I want my brace to go. And to give me a hand, I clamp my brace into place. Because no matter how well you try to hold this and drill your pilot hole for your screws, or you're driving your screws in, this is going to move on you. And by clamping it down, it makes sure that this stays exactly where you want it to be. And then I just double check my distance from the end of the bed rail with my square, and we're good to go. So now that I have this hole drilled and the brace, what I'll do is I'll run the screw in far enough, right there, and it's just touching the top of the bed rail, and the end of that screw is leaving a dimple to help guide my brad point bit. And it's real easy to find the center of your hole with the tip of your brad point bit. And then you just continue drilling your pilot hole for your front screw. Make sure I have the right size. Yep. And then once that's done, go ahead and run it home. Avoid the temptation to try to do both screws at the same time, because this is just going to help by having one in plus the clamp is going to make sure that this stays exactly where you want it to be. And the other thing I like to do is, if I can, ooh, that's tight, is I'll try to clock my screws so they all look the same way. Not necessary, but it's a nice little touch. And while it's on your bench, go ahead and put a nice chamfer on the edges. Now that our bed rails and braces are all installed back into the head and footboard, we need to figure out a way to secure the legs and cinch up any slack that we've deliberately designed into our cot system. So over here you see a finished product, and on the outside we need to put a tapered pin to pull everything together and hold it into place tightly. To do that, what I start out with is I make sure I install my bed rail, and I make sure that it's flush against the headboard and it's nice and tight up against the brace. And you can see here that I've even added a clamp to cinch up any slack that might exist between the leg and the headboard. Because you got to remember, our rivets here are still not secured. They're just there to hold everything together. So they're not going to add any tightness for us. So once we have the leg tight against the headboard, we have the brace up against the headboard, what we're going to do now is we're just going to take a nice sharp pencil, and we are going to draw a line as accurately as we can along the sides of the bed rail. And then what we're going to do is we are going to drill a slightly offset hole so we can install a tapered tenon and pull everything together. You can see here that I already went ahead and drilled our 3/4 inch hole in the center of the bed rail, and you can see here that we still have our scribe line from when we traced around our headboard, and you can see that this drill hole actually overshoots our scribe line by anywhere between, say, a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch. And what this will allow us to do by setting this peg hole just a little bit behind the line is it will allow us to make tapered pegs so that when we reassemble everything and we drive these pegs in, as these tapered pegs go into these offset holes, it's going to draw everything nice and tight together. For pegs, choose any hardwood, and these are 3.5 inches and 3/4 inches thick, and of course you'll need 4 of them. So I'm gonna go ahead and drill the other hole and show you how I taper these pins. Okay, now I have our 3.5 inch long pegs into my vise, and I'm just going to use my number 2 bench plane to create the taper. Take your time with this, sneak up on it, take a little bit off at a time, go test it, and just keep going back and forth until you find that sweet spot. You want these pins to draw everything tightly together, but at the same time, you don't want to have to force them in unnecessarily. It's sort of a Goldilocks zone that you're going to have to kind of figure out on your own. So just start on the far end. That's where you need your biggest taper to get it started. And then even it out, draw it out, and just take your time. And then test fit it. Now, before we're all done, so we have our taper end. On the opposite end from the taper, we're going to drill a hole to accept a length of rope. Each set of pins is going to be tied together with rope, and you'll get a chance to see what that looks like when I'm done here in a minute. And now with our pegs installed, we are almost done with our field cot. Now, to add to the pegs, I went ahead and drilled a 5/16 inch hole, 3/4 of an inch from the end of each peg. You may not be able to tell in the shot, but the tapers go in towards the bed, and the untapered end is on the outside of the bed. And that's where we drill our holes, and we put in our rope with a knot on the end. Now, the rope serves a couple nice functions. It helps to keep us from losing our pins. And when we disassemble our cot, these ropes will help us tie everything together in one big bundle for easy transportation. The other thing that I highly recommend that you consider is, this is one of those really custom projects that, especially if you're new, but this can happen to anybody, is each one of these pegs is going to fit slightly differently no matter how well you lay out. It's just kind of the nature of the thing. So what I recommend is that, since essentially each peg is fit to one end of the bed rail, is one thing you can do is just grab a chisel and just press in with your chisel, or you can give it a light tap with your hammer, Roman numerals matching the parts that they go to. So on this end, I have a 1 on the top of the bed rail, a 1 on the leg, and a 1 on the peg, and then 2, 3, and 4. And that way, you know how this thing goes together quickly, and you'll spend less time swapping rope, swapping pegs, and trying to find it so it fits properly. Now, before we set our rivets, go ahead and disassemble your cot completely. Give it your nice final sanding. And I highly recommend on your bed rails here that you break the edges on the tops of the rail. You can round them over pretty nicely. You could probably put a nice heavy chamfer along the inside on both sides of the rail. I'll probably do a round over. And the reason why you want to do that is because your canvas cover is going to sit here. And if you can just break this edge, it will make your canvas cover last a lot longer, because these edges are going to cause a lot of friction and wear on that canvas over time. Then, once it's all disassembled and sanded, you're ready to put a finish on your cot. One of the most common finishes would have been boiled linseed oil. I would probably put, I'd put 2 or 3 good coats of boiled linseed oil on it. I'm probably going to use something like a tung oil or a teak oil finish. They're not, tung oil, I believe, didn't come into the United States until after 1900. but it blends in with all the other oil finishes, and it has a couple modern protectants to help protect the wood a little bit more than just a standard boiled linseed oil would. The other thing I would do is make sure you may want to think about painting the bottoms of the feet, and that's going to help prevent wicking moisture up from the ground into the feet and help them last longer. Especially if you're using like a ring porous wood like this oak here. It really likes to suck up the moisture pretty quickly. And then we'll oil it, and we will go ahead and set the rivets. Before we get started with laying out and cutting our canvas, getting it ready to sew, I decided I wanted to take a couple minutes and go over a few quick details with setting the rivets. This one's already installed, but when you have your 1/4 inch rivets, the first thing you need to make sure you have are washers that fit it as perfectly as you can get it. And then you need to install your rivet through your pieces, put the washer on the outside, and then you have to figure out how long this rivet needs to be. Now, you typically want about 1/8 of an inch of material on these 1/4 inch rivets protruding above the washer. Now, if you have too much material, you're going to have too much to peen over, and it won't seat properly. So you'll have a really loose, floppy leg. And if you go too short, then you won't have enough material, and you may not have enough metal to hold the washer in place. It may wear out over time, and it's going to be difficult for you to kind of make it look like a rivet because you won't have as much material to move around. So about 1/8 of an inch is kind of a sweet spot. You'll definitely need to kind of figure out what's going to work best for you, but that'll give you a good starting point. Then you are going to need something hard to set the rivet on. Now, an anvil is certainly convenient, but in this case, it's not. Because this is such a long piece of wood, you have to balance on a single 1/4 inch head point over an anvil and try to have controlled, precise blows to keep you from damaging your workpiece. So when I'm doing these projects, I just grab a piece of flat stock and I set it over one of the legs of my workbench to absorb the hammer blows better. And I just work on this scrap piece of steel as my rivet setting anvil. And it works great. Now, the other thing too, as a bit of advice, is you don't want to bruise or damage this area. It's going to be unsightly. And to help with that is I like to use just a big fender washer. And to kind of keep it clean and prevent any scratching, I put some masking tape on the bottom of it. And this allows me to prevent and control any overstrike or slippage. Because when you're peening, you start in the middle and you're trying to spread out the metal so you can get the rivet head on the side that you're working on. And so rather than just trying to beat it super hard, you're taking consistent, even blows with your ball peen hammer, and you're trying to stretch the metal all the way around evenly. And sometimes in order to get that, this can slip. And having a large washer to protect your workpiece is going to be very handy. Also, because once we get everything flattened out, it's going to be this sort of like a big flat top. Then we need to start curving the sides down, and that's because we have to move and manipulate the metal. It's going to be really easy to overstrike and have a circle of dents all the way around the rivet. And that's where having a flat washer handy to protect your workpiece is going to be priceless. Now, once you have the metal peened out, and then we flip it over and we start using the flat hammer side to start curving the rivet head over, one of the hardest things to do is get this final nice even flush mount to the washer. And one thing that doesn't get mentioned too often is using a punch. And so once I get the bulk of the material turned down into a dome shape, the final strikes are going to be getting this punch right in here on the edge and striking it all the way around until I get that nice even dome shape. And if you have any oddities or irregularities in the way that you peened, once everything's nice and secure, you can go back and put your washer on and just do decorative strikes with your ball peen hammer to make your rivet look even.
With our rivet set and our cot reassembled, it's time to start measuring to design our cot cover. For this, you're going to want to use a nice sturdy cotton duck canvas, and you need to think about the way in which you are going to stitch this cover. And to get started, we want to make sure we pay attention to where we take our measurements. The most accurate place to get your measurements for the width is going to be as close to the mortise as you can get, because these bed rails could bow, they could flex, they could be off in the middle, but it's less likely to have any issues closer to the mortise. So in this case, I have dead on 27 inches. So I know the top of the cot cover needs to be 27 inches. But I also need to come down the side of the bed rail. And my bed rails are 2.5 inches tall on each side. So if I want, say, 2 inches overhang on each side, I need to add 4 inches, because we're doing the math for both sides. And then I want to have a 3-inch hem, so I need to add 6 inches on top of that. And then I want a 1-inch hem so that I don't have any exposed edges on the underside of my cot cover. So once you figure out the process in which you want to have your hems and your seam allowances, then you start to get the dimensions of your cot cover. And you can do this any number of ways. That's why I'm not getting too particular in how you do it. You just mostly want to make sure that on the sides, from the side to the top, you have a double layer of canvas. However you go about getting there, that's fine. Because these edges of the bed rails, even though we rounded them over and smoothed them, they're going to receive the most amount of strain. So you want at least 2 layers of canvas on the sides and the top edges of the bed rails for longevity. And then you're also going to want to make sure that when you measure the length of your cot cover, in my case, this bed rail is 72 inches long, I'm going to add 2 inches to that 72 for a 74-inch length of canvas. And then I'm going to add a 1-inch hem to each end, so that way I have finished seams on both ends, and it will still come out to 72 inches. Take your time, take lots of measurements, draw it out, and you can always say, start with the end, hemming the ends of the cot, and check your length, and then you could just do your finished hem on one side of the bed rail, and then without finishing the second half, you can confirm your measurements and your design. So a little bit of time with a tape measure and a pencil and paper will give you an easy and satisfactory result for your cot cover.
With our cot cover sewn, we have our nice 3-inch hem on the side, double stitched on the top, and a nice stitch along the edge to add a little bit more strength for the tacks that we're going to use and to help keep everything nice and flat. You can see I already started by getting a few of these copper tacks set in the corner, and then the rest is just a lot of hammering. For this project, Hammer recommends, I believe, these number 10 by 5/8 inch copper tacks, and you'll need about 125 of them. And once you get your corners tacked in and stretched out, you'll want to drive a tack every 1.5 inches along the bottom of your bed, keeping it nice and snug. Now, how tight you make this is going to be a little bit up to you. I do want to recommend that you don't make it too tight, because it's going to make stretching it and assembling it a real challenge sometimes. So you want it snug, but maybe not super tight. And the other tool I highly recommend is a tack hammer. Now, you can use a regular full-size hammer, but your fingers will greatly appreciate you using a lightweight and nimble tack hammer for this project.
There you go. Now you have your very own Civil War field cot ready to give you a good night's rest off the cold, damp ground. Thanks for sticking around and watching this rather long and detailed video on how to make this. There's a lot of little details that kind of make or break this project. Let us know if you have any questions down in the comments below. Thanks as always for liking and subscribing and sharing up these videos. We'll see you next time.